So today we're going to be going over the willow family known as the Salicaceae. Now, the Salicaceae is historically a small family, but has recently been expanded to include a lot of assorted, mostly tree and shrub-like plants. And so they don't have the most consistent traits as far as telling what you're dealing with. They have a few dozen genera that each have maybe a few species, with the exception of willow that has over 400 species. In general, they have two ranked, alternately arranged leaves, which is common in a lot of families. When somebody refers to leaves as being two ranked, it means that they exist on different planes of division along the stem. So rather than being all on one face of the three-dimensional stem, they are on multiple faces, and this is merely an adaptation to allow for the most efficient photosynthesis, because if leaves were directly above one another, the plants would shade their younger leaves or older leaves with the younger leaves, or the leaves that are higher up, and that would make photosynthesis more of a challenge. A lot of tree species actually will kill off lower branches as they grow because the upper branches shade out the lower branches, and those lower branches are no longer useful for photosynthesis. That's why we see a lot of trees where the lower portions of the trunk have old dead branch pieces or remnants of the branches that lack the leaves. They used to have leaves, but now they don't. These have laminar venation, so the leaf lamina, just the leaf itself, has veins that curve or kind of weave inside of one another. Their leaf margins are considered entire, so rather than being lobed like, say, a maple leaf or an oak leaf, it's kind of one contiguous shape, although there can be saw teeth and such along the edge. Their petioles, or the stalk that attaches the leaves to the stem, has glands, and their flowers either don't have petals at all, or they have petals in multiples of 3 or 6. Their nectaries have lobes to them. We're not going to worry too much about that. So it's really this unique combination of characteristics as well as some molecular stuff that unifies the Salicaceae, but please keep in mind that these are incredibly generic traits that can be found across multiple different families. We are going to focus mostly on willow and poplar, which are kind of cosmopolitan, very important trees. So, willow and poplar are what we know as dioecious plants, where rather than having flowers that have both pollen and nectar, the entire plant either only produces pollen or the entire plant will only produce seed. Generally, it's an insect pollinated group, and so insects are going to go from the male flower to the female flower. Oftentimes, the female flower doesn't really have a nectary reward that the male flower does, and the female flower kind of looks or smells enough like the male flower to trick the insect into visiting it, which is how pollen gets to the female flower to fertilize the seeds inside. This is not like other tree families where these seeds are dropped in the fall and they germinate the following spring. This is a group wherein the seed is dispersed, viability is very short, so you can't store the seeds for more than a week before they die, and they would land on the ground and within a day germinate. The first thing that would happen would be several small root hairs anchoring the seedling down, and then the cotyledons emerging, allowing for growth. Members of this family are generally very rapid growing. A lot of them have mycorrhizal fungi, which are just fungus that live in the soil that help add material to the roots. One of the interesting things about poplar is that they can clone themselves. Different aspens, particularly trembling aspen, which has a 50-mile pure stand that's all one clone, they can form an entire forest. They're all genetically identical trees. They all originate from the root system of the first tree, and a lot of these clones prefer to reproduce this way because when you go through the process of sexual reproduction, you actually change up your genetic profile because you have the pollen genes mixing with the seed genes, and when the pollen and seeds are produced, you half the genes and you mix things around. Now, if you're in a good spot wherein whatever genetic makeup you have is allowing you to survive in your particular environment, it's more advantageous to you, the spread of your genes, to just clone yourself. So, sexual reproduction is good for a lot of organisms, but it does have its risks because you can produce individuals that are less fit than yourselves as well as producing individuals that are more fit. It's only when the clone or the large stand of cloned trees gets stressed somehow do they switch to a mode where they flower so they can switch up their genes in the event that they are all wiped out by something. Again, this family is found all over the world. Willow and poplar are mostly in the northern hemisphere, generally in temperate regions. We have both the European poplar and willows here as well as our native ones, and it's because of how useful these plants have been to us. So, we're not going to worry too much about where they belong in the entire plant kingdom. They are dicotyledonous, which means they are, an angiosperm or flowering plant. They're vascular plants. Willow and poplar are the closest relatives to each other in the Salicaceae. The Salicaceae is in a large order of plants known as the Malpigales, which has a bunch of families that we're going to talk about later, including the Euphorbiaceae, which has spurge, poinsettia, purslane, which is an edible green, the Passifloraceae, Violaceae, and a whole bunch of other things. And if you have seen members of these other families, which most people have, they don't strike you as being closely related to willow and poplar trees, but they are related to willow and poplar trees. So, we don't really eat willow, and this is what sets this aside from a lot of the other families we're going to cover. This is farm elective. We want to think about farming for food. We also want to talk about farming for other reasons. I included this because it's kind of food for food. Willow is used to feed livestock animals. If you happen to eat meat, or if you eat honey, the bees use willow pollen early on in the season before other things are blooming, because a lot of these willows bloom first thing in the spring because they have a development mode where that seed has to hit the ground before too much time passes so that the seed has as much of the summer to grow as possible. We have 300 to 400 willow species. They hybridize with each other very easily, so actually identifying which willow you're dealing with is incredibly difficult. People really love the ornamental value of their flowers, which are called catkins. They are often fluffy when they first emerge. You can make all sorts of crafts with willows. You can, have species with very flexible bark and wood, so you can make rods, baskets, fences, all sorts of structures. You can make live fences with them. They're used for stream bank or stream bed repair. They is a water-loving plant generally. There are some species in the Salicaceae that are not particularly, or in the genus Salix, which is the willow genus, that aren't particularly fond of water, like the dwarf prairie willow that I've been growing. But for the most part, willows are really fans of wet feet, moist soil, really good for pollution control in wetlands, really good for restoration of various things. And poplar, and I really was hoping we would be doing this in person so we could perhaps, try and make a little bit of poplar wood pulp and such. Poplar is grown for paper, pulp, and a number of other things. They can plant poplar in rings around areas so wind can't get in as easily, because poplar is pretty good at resisting wind. Poplar grows relatively quickly. It's very easy to grow. There are hybrid poplars that resist certain pests and diseases that are used almost for intense paper production. It's a lot more renewable than just clear-cutting a forest that took hundreds of years to get to where it was, because it takes less than a decade to get poplar to a size where you can cut it down for its wood. And so people make pulp products, paper products, a number of different things out of poplar. And in some parts of Asia, it is a major economic activity, to the point where there are labs in institutions in China, like at colleges, that do molecular research on with pesticides, because several moth species are serious pests of these poplar plantations. That is how seriously they take some of this poplar growing. It's really amazing. So this is a useful family. Willow, you can also take the bark and make extract for rooting plant cuttings from other groups. And aspirin comes from salicylic acid, which was initially derived from willow before we figured out how to synthesize it.